In the year 2020, 1 year after a global pandemic, the entire world's population has seemingly succumbed to the disease. One man in Tucson, Arizona, believes he might be the last man on Earth and is on the verge of ending his life due to loneliness and isolation. What Phil doesn't know is that he might not be as alone as he thought. Phil Miller drives a large camper van across the entire continent of North America, searching for other survivors. He announces his presence using a PA system attached to the roof of the van. He crosses out each state on the map when he finishes searching them. Soon, Phil finds himself on the border of Utah and crosses it off the map. He realizes that he's covered everything and he screams out in frustration. He takes a spray paint can and writes "Alive in Tucson" on the Utah sign and heads home to Tucson. In his apartment, Phil throws his keys on the table and opens the blinds to let the light in. He looks around his apartment and yearns for an upgrade in his living situation. Later that day, Phil drives his camper van to a wealthy neighborhood and chooses one of the mansions to live in. He stands by the pool behind the house, looks at the view, and he nods to himself. A few minutes later, Phil begins taking the things from his camper van into the house, including a rug from the White House and some priceless paintings he's collected from multiple museums. He hangs the paintings up all over the mansion and places a dinosaur skull on top of the dining room table. He hangs a Michael Jordan jersey on a wall and puts Oscar statues on the mantle. Lastly, he hangs a small, framed picture of his family. That night, Phil prays while lying in bed and tells God about how he drove across the country looking for survivors and leaving signs everywhere he went. He says that it's not all bad because he would have never been able to live in a mansion in the old world. He also lists the drawbacks of being the last man on Earth, such as having no woman around. He wishes God could send a woman his way and to thank the previous owners of the mansion. The next day, Phil fills the toilet tank with water to be able to flush it. Later, Phil goes to a supermarket and shoots the doors to get inside. He fills a shopping cart with junk food and grabs all of the adult magazines. On his drive home, Phil sees a mannequin on a storefront and admires its body. That evening, Phil thanks God for his $10,000 wine as he pairs it with cheap canned food. Weeks later, Phil plays bowling in the parking lot of a bowling alley. He then switches the pins for lamps and rolls a bowling ball to break them. Later, he arranges a stack of aquariums, places dozens of bowling balls on the bed of his pickup truck, and quickly drives backward in the direction of the aquariums. He abruptly stops, causing the bowling balls to roll off and crash into the aquariums. Hours later, Phil tapes a gas can onto a car and pushes another car down a ramp. When the cars collide, a large explosion occurs and he cheers. That evening, Phil uses a generator to turn the TV on and he watches the movie Castaway. He's wearing the Michael Jordan jersey while jeering Tom Hanks' character for talking to a volleyball. He says that this will never happen to him and he'll never talk to a volleyball because balls aren't people. The next day, Phil wears full metal armor and stands in front of a tennis ball machine, just letting the balls hit him. Inside the mansion, Phil crosses out June 17th on the calendar. That evening, Phil sits alone at a bar and lights a candle on top of a Twinkie. He remembers his family and friends singing him happy birthday in that same bar before the pandemic. He looks around at the empty bar and blows out his candle. Later that night, Phil tells God that he doesn't need people and he'll be just fine on his own. 5 months later, the entire mansion is littered with trash. Phil starts his day off by drinking leftover booze from the bottles scattered around him and wipes his mouth with the Declaration of Independence. Outside the mansion, Phil fills a kiddie pool with margarita mix and gets in. A gigantic pile of garbage is forming in the pool behind him. He pours salt on the rim of the kiddie pool and sips the pool margarita with a straw. Later, Phil can no longer reach the toilet because of all the water bottles around it. Outside, Phil saws a hole through a diving board and turns the pool into a massive toilet. Later that day, Phil goes to the bar and offers drinks to the balls he's drawn faces on. He's named each of the balls and tells them a list of all the things he misses from the old world. He says that he'll never complain about anything ever again if he just gets to see one more woman. That evening, Phil takes Gary the volleyball to the storefront with the mannequin. He has a conversation with Gary where he gets convinced to talk to the mannequin. He approaches the store and shoots the glass to get inside. Phil has a conversation with the mannequin and kisses it on the lips. He shakes the mannequin's hand to introduce himself, but it detaches from the body. He drops the arm, exits the store, and looks up at the sky and says God has won. The next day, Phil is in the desert where he spray paints a giant rock as his tombstone. He's placed his ball friends on the rocks and drawn a red and white target on one of the bottom rocks. Minutes later, Phil gives himself a short eulogy. He apologizes to the cast and crew of Castaway because he now knows how accurate the movie was in regards to being lonely enough to talk to a volleyball. Later, Phil gets in the pickup truck and backs away from the rock. He takes a big gulp of booze before driving toward the rock with the target. Just as he's about to hit the rock, he sees something in his peripheral view that causes him to step on the brakes. He gets out of the truck and climbs up on it and sees black smoke in the distance. He quickly gets back in the truck and drives to where the smoke is coming from and sees a campsite. Phil sees women's undergarments hanging on a clothesline and smells it while laughing joyously. He hears a woman clearing her throat behind him and he passes out. A few minutes later, Phil wakes up and sees a beautiful woman looking down on him as he lays his head on her lap. He sings her the Ghostbusters theme song and they share a kiss. All of a sudden, the beautiful woman goes from kissing him to performing CPR. Phil finally wakes up from the dream and screams when he sees a different woman, Carol, performing CPR on him. He backs away from Carol and asks her where the other woman went. Carol explains that he passed out and wet his pants, so she had to revive him. Phil frantically explains to Carol that his pants were wet even before he passed out. He approaches Carol too closely and she takes out a gun from her purse and tells him to back off. Moments later, Carol asks Phil if he's a nice guy, and he fearfully tries to convince her that he's nice. He admits that he did wet himself, and she asks him if he's the one who left the "Alive in Tucson" signs. He says he wrote those signs and apologizes to her for being weird, because he hasn't seen another human being for 2 years. He tells her how he was literally about to end his life a few minutes ago before he saw the smoke. Phil eventually convinces Carol to put the gun away, and they introduce themselves to each other. Later that day, Carol talks about her journey while they drink coffee. Phil mentions he was a temp in the old world, and she says she was an office manager for a hot sauce company. On the drive back, Phil gets annoyed by Carol's constant reminders of following the stop signs, despite no other vehicles running in the entire state, but he obliges anyway. She tells him how excited she is to see his house. At the mansion, Phil shows Carol the toilet pool, garbage dump pool, and his margarita pool. Inside the house, Carol sees the piles of adult magazines and the mountains of trash all over the living room, and can't help calling Phil out on the horrible state his house is in. Phil gives her a strained smile and tells her that she should probably head back to her campsite now. At the campsite, Carol tells Phil that she's looking forward to helping him get his life back together. The next day, Phil wakes up due to the noise Carol's cleaning is causing. She tells him they need to get more cleaning supplies from the store. Outside the store, Phil and Carol get into an argument when he parks in the handicapped spot. He grows weary of Carol's nagging and drives the truck directly into the hardware store. Carol tells him that he no longer follows any rules, so he backs out of the store to appease her. That evening, Phil is in the bar hanging out with his ball buddies and vents about his annoyance at Carol. He admits he finds her cute sometimes, but only until she starts talking. Ironically, he thinks he needs a little space from her. Later that day, Phil sees Carol moving her things into the house next to his. He runs out and tells her that she can choose any house in the world so she doesn't need to be in the house directly next to his. Seconds later, Carol tells Phil that they both know their purpose for being chosen to survive. Phil doesn't get what she means and she explains that they need to be together to repopulate the earth. Phil says he'd never sleep with her, but she's adamant in fixing him until she too can stomach sleeping with him. Later, Carol surprises Phil while he's on the toilet and says she just wants to live like a human being again, take a shower, and have a working toilet. She also wants their kids to have fresh fruits and vegetables, but he stops her. Phil repeats that he does not want to have kids with her and doesn't care about fresh fruits and vegetables. She shows him a fresh ripe tomato and takes a bite. She needs his help getting water for her garden, but he refuses to help her. That evening, Phil sneaks into Carol's garden and steals tomatoes from her plants. The next day, Carol confronts Phil about her tomatoes and he feigns ignorance while his beard and clothes are covered in tomato bits. As Carol walks away, Phil notices that she's limping and asks her what happened. She says she dropped a manhole cover on it, but that she's fine. That night, Phil can hear Carol still working on how to get the water working. Days later, Phil sees Carol looking disheveled as she throws her trash by her front door. Later, Phil sees her place a wooden plank with a hole in it over a fountain. She places toilet paper next to the wooden plank and is about to pull her pants down, but he stops her. She tells him that she's given up because if she can't even grow a tomato, how could she raise an actual human being? Phil feels bad for indirectly turning Carol into a mess like himself. A few hours later, Phil takes several garden hoses over to a large water tank. The next day, Carol knocks on Phil's door and shows him the makeshift watering system over her garden. She thanks him by inviting him over for dinner tonight, and he tells her that it felt great being so selfless. That evening, Carol is dressed nicely while Phil eats the food with his hands. Carol has reconsidered repopulating the earth with Phil, but only if they get married first. Phil doesn't want to marry her, but she insists that their children not be born out of wedlock. They get into an argument, and Phil goes outside to let out an exasperated scream before coming back inside. Carol wants him to propose on one knee, so Phil apprehensively obliges, then proposes to her, which she accepts. Phil claps sarcastically while leaving the house as Carol jumps around excitedly.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.